Hello, everyone, and welcome to this, our first Lunch and Learn of the fall semester of 2024. We're so glad that you could join us among the many things that are pulling at your attention, because we have someone really special here to do our presentation today, and his name is Dustin Gillespie, and he's a special agent with Drug Enforcement Administration. He has been at it for almost 20 years and oversees the DEA in Utah. And he's well poised to give us an update on drug trends in our state. And on a personal note, he's from rural Utah, and he might tell you what town as he speaks. But we're so happy and so lucky to have him join us. And so the time is yours, Mr. Gillespie.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. It's actually rural Alaska, not rural Utah, so a little bit further away, and a lot more trees, and a lot more cold weather. But yeah, up near the Arctic Circle is where I grew up. But enough about me. Yes, I've been with DEA now for 18 years, here in Utah in this position for about 3 years now, and I did most of my casework down on the southwest border, out of the Phoenix, Arizona office, and then a couple of tours through our different headquarters offices, one in El Paso, Texas, and another back in DC. I was also an instructor at our Special Agent Academy for a couple of years. So we've had lots of opportunities with the DEA, and this is a fantastic office to be in. We do great work, big cases. I was surprised to see the volume and the quantity and the complexity of our drug cases here in Utah, and I think it catches a lot of folks by surprise that may not think of Utah as a place where we see a lot of drugs, or we see a lot of drugs in combination with violent crime, but it is here in spades. And so my investigators here, are quite busy. So um, if you have questions, I would actually prefer to take them, when you have them, rather than waiting to the very end. If it's something that you see on a slide that sparks that question, let's dive into it while it's top of mind, rather than wait to the end and then we try to remember what we were looking at before. But however you guys want to do it, that's fine as well. It's way more fun for me to have a little bit of a dialogue. It's kind of tough sometimes virtually, but I think we can get it done if I don't crash my computer here or knock it off my little pedestal. But so that's kind of how I do it. Super, super laid back. And I hope that you kind of find some of this stuff interesting. Um, so just kind of for context, I do oversee DEA here in Utah, but I'm part of the Rocky Mountain Field Division, which consists of 4 states: Utah, Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado. And so my boss, who oversees that entire division, sits in Denver. So lucky for me, I'm far away, out of sight and out of mind. But he did call in to check in on me to see what I've been doing, because he hasn't heard from me in a few days. But so that kind of gives you context for where DEA is here in Utah. So let's press on. Quickly, just an agenda. I think in order to understand really what our problem is here and what we see on the ground level, the street level, what drugs are being peddled and sold in our neighborhoods, in our communities, in our schools, in the malls. We've got to go all the way back, and we've got to go up to that 100,000-foot level, and take a look at that supply chain. We have to understand, I think, where it's coming from, how it's getting here, and that gives us a better background and better context for what we're actually seeing, like I said, in our schools and our communities, and for us in our investigations and what we're seizing. So we're going to do that. We're going to jump up to 100,000-foot level, and we're going to talk about fentanyl, a little bit about methamphetamine, but mostly fentanyl, how it's where the precursor chemicals are coming from, how are they getting to Mexico, and then across our border up here into the United States and eventually Utah. When I have a little bit more time, an hour is kind of a long time, but I will talk, if I have a little more than that, I'll talk about methamphetamine, because that's a very persistent and prevalent problem here in Utah. It's not getting any better. It's getting worse. But really, our greatest drug threat is fentanyl. And so I'm going to spend basically the whole time, you know, this afternoon, it is afternoon now, talking about fentanyl. And as we come down from that 100,000 foot level to the ground level here in the Salt Lake Valley and across Utah, I'll show you all hopefully a lot of pictures, because I'd rather you look at pictures and the slides than my ugly mug here up on the video. So I try to put a lot of populate the slides with a lot of photos and photographs of the seizures that we're actually making here, here in Utah, and particularly the majority of those here in the Salt Lake Valley. And I'll talk briefly at the end about some emerging trends as well, that we're starting to see, and some things that maybe we should be thinking about as a community. So again, so we're going to jump up to that 100,000 foot level, like I said before. And the first thing I want you to understand is that the drug supply chain doesn't start here in Utah. So if you look at these pictures, it's almost overwhelming. I'm very familiar with this case. This was a case out of Phoenix, Arizona. It was a very good case, but you need to know that this is one of hundreds and hundreds of DEA cases that are ongoing, along the southwest border. I'm not even talking about the rest of the cases and investigations that go across the remainder of the continental United States. These are cases that we see frequently, commonly, monthly, weekly on the southwest border, and these are the quantities that we're seizing. Right, 4.5 million fentanyl pills. Those are all the blue pills, packages of blue pills there. Almost 150 pounds of fentanyl powder itself, more than 3,000 pounds of meth. That meth is all, you can see some of that packaged up in the white, it looks white and a little bit clearish, but some of it's also wrapped up in those yellow and black bricks. 300 pounds of cocaine, it's overwhelming. And wherever there are drugs, nearly 100% of the time we're finding firearms as well. So those two things go hand in hand. The drug traffickers are almost always armed to protect their shipments and whatnot. But I can tell you for certain, with 100% certainty, that a portion of these drugs that you're looking at in these pictures, and this is recent, within probably the last 12 months, 14 months, I'd say, was when the seizures were made. A portion of these were coming to Utah. And I know that for a fact because I know the case agents who put this case together. So who are supplying all of these drugs? It's two primary cartels, the Sinaloa cartel and CJNG, New Generation Cartel Jalisco. So the Jalisco cartel, and I've highlighted those states down there, in Mexico: orange, Jalisco; blue, Sinaloa. They are at odds with each other. They're always fighting for territory, for control of drug routes. And particularly these areas, which I'll show you, along the border on the Mexico side, they're referred to as plazas. And those cartels, there you see a lot of violence as they gain control of these plazas where the ports are. So on the Mexico side of these ports, like Nogales or San Isidro. But these are the two main cartels. They don't just supply Utah, they supply the vast majority of all the drugs that are coming into the United States. These are the two powerhouses, Mexico-based cartels. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to talk about the Sinaloa cartel. And that's because the Sinaloa cartel, I would say, probably supplies more than 90% of all the drugs that come into the Utah. Yes, CJNG has a presence here. There are probably, arguably, maybe 8 to 12 other drug cartels in Mexico that supply vast quantities of drugs into the US. But for the purposes of this, Sinaloa cartel, like I said, supplies more than 90% of all the drugs coming into Utah. And so that's who I'm going to talk about. You can see, again, I've highlighted the state of Sinaloa. But make no mistake, that may be the state of Sinaloa, but they control much more geographic areas north of the state of Sinaloa. They control a big portion of northern Mexico and northwestern Mexico in particular. So we're still at that 100,000 foot level. fentanyl and meth, they need to be manufactured and synthesized, and the cartels can't do that alone. They don't have the necessary chemicals and precursor elements to do that process. So they have to get them from somewhere. Where do they get them from? The vast majority from China, to a much lesser extent, India. Um, those precursors come in huge shipments, barrels, boxes, and they're shipped via. I think I have a slide here coming up on in cargo freight on big cargo barges and ships. Sometimes air freight and air cargo as well. But those precursors are generated and manufactured in China, and the Sinaloa cartel purchases them. So they have scientists, they have associates in China who are manufacturing these, who control the various um, laboratories that produce these. Very difficult to control and monitor and regulate from the perspective of the United States because they have legitimate uses. These precursor chemicals are utilized to make pharmaceutical grade drugs that we take on a daily basis. And so differentiating what between what is for legitimate purposes and what isn't can be a difficult task. And then on top of that, we don't necessarily get along or see eye to eye with the Chinese government on many things, including the drug epidemic that we're facing here nationally and here in the state of Utah as well. So definitely some challenges and hurdles there in sort of regulating and monitoring the precursors as they leave China and come into um, the country of Mexico. So these are the pictures I was just referring to. If you look at the top left there, those are just barrels stacked up of precursor chemicals. So you can see it's not a very clean or sanitary environment. That's outdoor. It's a photograph in China. But again, those are all precursor chemicals that are going to be used for the manufacturing of methamphetamine and fentanyl once it gets in Mexico. That bottom left is one of the first seizures of precursor chemical utilized to make fentanyl that the DEA sees. So that was one of those first. That was in a cargo box on one of these cargo ships. And again, sometimes air freight, but the majority of them are coming across the water to various ports along the western seaboard on in the country of Mexico. So as soon as they hit those ports, those seaports in Mexico, the cartels, in this case, the Sinaloa cartel, controls that port. They'll deploy military assets, they'll deploy cartel assets to immediately secure those chemicals. And then they have this vast network of laboratories, small little laboratories in which they can disperse these chemicals, these precursor chemicals, and then they begin the synthesizing process. So when I say these labs, I use that term very loosely. I put them here in quotes because if you look at the top left there, those are the chemists, the scientists that I'm referring to. Same with the photo on the right with the the level B Tyvek suit that he's wearing. Really provide. There is no there are no safety measures. There are no quality controls here. In fact, that picture was a snapshot out of a PBS special in which they brought in the Sinaloa cartel, brought in a reporter and embedded them in one of these cooks here. And they're cooking black tar heroin there in that outdoor ranch area with the cattle in the background. They just have a propane burner and a cattle trough that they're cooking it over. And then they've got bags of fentanyl powder that they've synthesized and they're dumping it in there and you can see if you watch that special you see the fentanyl powder blowing back into their faces and it's a sad state of affairs obviously. I mean, these folks are not wealthy. They're living in poverty, doing what they can to make money for their families and their kids. But this is very common. They're out in the middle of nowhere in places like this to avoid detection from law enforcement. That photograph on the bottom left was the first fentanyl um, synthesizing lab that DEA ever seized a couple decades ago. But the thing about these labs, the quote unquote labs, so that picture on the right with the guy in the Tyvek suit, um, they're very small. It's a very decentralized process, and it's very little overhead to get the chemicals and the burners, the glassware to synthesize the fentanyl. So you can set that up in an extra bedroom. You can set it up on your kitchen counter, um, out here on the back patio. Really, it can be anywhere. And the reason for this is when law enforcement or the military finds one of these labs and dismantles it, it does essentially nothing to their overall production capabilities because they have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these labs all throughout the state of Sinaloa and then beyond up in the other states like Sonora. That's a little bit different than what you might have heard about super labs with methamphetamine and methamphetamine production. That was Sinaloa cartel still uses that sort of philosophy and production, capability to produce meth, but they're moving away from that because when you dismantle a super lab, those super labs, I think I have it on the next slide too, produces hundreds and hundreds of pounds a day. And when you dismantle one of those, it does have an impact on their production capabilities. And so they've learned through the production of the fentanyl and this decentralized laboratories that this is a great way to go and minimize detection from law enforcement and any disruption to their overall operations. So this picture here just shows what a pretty simple pill pressing operation looks like. So once the cartels, they get the precursor chemicals, they bring them to the labs, they synthesize the fentanyl. It's not a complicated process. The folks in that previous slide, they learn it within a couple of hours. They man those labs 24 hours a day, and they run the glassware, they run the heater, and they produce the fentanyl, and it's in generally a powder form. Now, once they get it into powder form, they can leave it in powder form and package it up. But generally, most often, they're going to press it into a pill. And so they take that powder and they go to the next step, which is a pill pressing operation. And again, those are very, very, very simple. Back bedroom, broom closet, kitchen counter, that kind of thing. And you can see here, it's just on it looks like a Costco fold out table. This is actually a local pill pressing operation that was dismantled. And if you look at those pill presses there, well, first of all, you can see all the powder strewn about. There's certainly no quality controls there. There's fentanyl powder mixed with binding agent just kind of strewn everywhere. A Lowe's bucket down there below. And really, that's all they're doing. They're taking metal bowls, they're taking blenders, and they're just kind of eyeballing things, eyeballing fentanyl powder and adding it to binding agent and excipient powders, which will add a color. It's like a food coloring, but it's a pill coloring that they'll add in there. And that's it. They'll press it through these presses. And if you look at these presses, these are closer to the 500 pills per hour production capability. But for these cartels, they're more interested in massive production. So they want those pill presses that are, closer to the 15,000, maybe 20,000 pills per hour. Those cost about 17 to $20,000. Yes, they come from Mexico as well. But remember these cartels who make billions and billions in profits every year, losing a $17,000 pill press means nothing. Um, and so this decentralized approach again is really works really, really well for the cartels. And lastly, if you look at that bottom picture there, I kind of wanted you to take a mental snapshot of what you're looking at there. When that reporter, again, this was another snapshot from that PBS special with the embedded reporter, they took her to one of these pill presses. And as the camera panned around the room, I paused it and I took a snapshot of this little packaging here. So once they press these pills, they've got millions and millions of pills. They've got to package them up in order to put them into a shipment and drive them up here to the United States. And very, very commonly, this is what they'll do. They kind of put them in a tube shape, almost like about the size of a brick. About the size of a brick of pills, that's going to be about 10,000 pills. But if you look at that shrink wrap package, what they've done is they've put it sort of in a tube shape. They've wrapped it in carbon paper because they think that that will help protect it from any X-rays that they might have to undergo by Border Patrol as they're crossing the border. It would prevent Border Patrol from detecting these packages concealed in vehicles by X-ray. And then they'll tape off just brown packaging tape. They'll tape the ends, and then they'll shrink wrap it. Very, very, very common way of packaging up these pills. But they do it a lot of different ways. But I wanted you to take a mental snapshot of what you're looking at there, of that one particular package, because we'll come back to a local seizure that looks very, very similar. So they've got everything packaged. They need to get it up to the border, and they need to get it across, and then they need to get it out um, to a distribution city, wherever that may be across the United States. Like I mentioned before, there's these areas up along the border, and I've drawn the routes. Like we know exactly how they're getting these drugs from the state of Sinaloa up to the borders and across. It's no secret. I've been on many cases listening to the phones on wiretaps, and they talk about, you know, loading up these vehicles down in Sinaloa and driving them up. They'll stage them in places like Hermosillo here. I don't know if my pointer shows where that is, but that's about 3 hours away from Nogales, the Nogales port of entry there, and that would be this one right up here on the kind of that little angle there on the southern Arizona. That's about 3 hours away. Very common staging place. So they'll load it up in a vehicle or a tractor trailer, and they'll drive it up to a place like Hermosillo, and they'll wait for them to receive orders and say, okay, drive it, and you need to get it up here and cross. And they'll cross in all these various different ports. It's not just Arizona, but that's very, very, very common. Nogales, Lukeville, Douglas, Algodones. One of the most heavily used ports is San Isidro in Southern California there, but there's also Mesa, Tecate, all of those various ports. They're getting hammered with these drug loads as they come across. And I often at this point get a question about, well, man, if we know the routes, like you've highlighted them here, um, why don't we catch more at the border? Why don't we just beef up the amount of law enforcement at the border and just seize it before it even comes across or as it's coming across? And my response is, man, you got to go down to the border and take a look at those ports. Because if you go over to San Isidro over here in Southern California, which is just across from San Diego for the most part, um, just north of Tijuana, I think they've got something like 30 to 35 lanes northbound. And when you stand there and you look at those 35 lanes and they are stacked up bumper to bumper for 10, 15, 20 miles as far as the eye can see, you realize that, holy smokes, like we can't stop and look at everybody. And then you think, well, why don't we have more canine drug sniffing dogs? They can just find the ones that have the drugs. When you think, man, it's the reality of that is it's really hot down there. And those canines, they can work for about 15 to 20 minutes before they get burned out and they start exhibiting signs of heat exhaustion. So you've got to take them off the line for an hour to 2 hours to give them rest and rehydrate before you can put them on for another 15 to 20 minutes. So there are a lot of challenges there, certainly. It does sound like, a very simple, kind of the first response is like, man, if we know these routes and we know exactly where all of these drugs, these millions and millions of dollars of drugs and millions of pills are coming across, why don't we stop it there? But again, just as a reminder, these areas right just below the various ports, we refer to those as plazas, and there are cartel bosses who control those regional and geographic areas. Sinaloa cartel controls the majority of these plazas that you're looking at here. And what that means is that every other cartel who wants to utilize those plazas, including Cartel Jalisco, the Jalisco cartel, they pay taxes. So they have to notify the Sinaloa cartel that they're sending drugs through these ports, and then a tax is assigned for that. And so anytime that a leadership is killed or there's somebody dies of old age or there's some battle and there's a power vacuum there, the cartels fight for control of those plazas because whoever controls those plazas controls the flow of drugs coming through those particular areas. So when you see some of that stuff on the news, a lot of that has to do with control of these plazas because those are the main arterial routes for the drugs to come into the United States. And again, I showed this route particularly because these are the routes that they take to get to Utah to get the drugs. Yes, they cross through New Mexico and they cross through southern Texas as well. But for the purposes of our talk today, what I'm showing you right now, these are the routes that the drugs that are sitting here in Utah, that these are the routes that they took. How do they get here? Very common to see them stashed away in tractor trailers. This one, kind of a bad example, but in fact, the fentanyl powder that you can kind of see in the picture on the right there, those are brick-shaped 30 kilograms of fentanyl powder. It's an unbelievable amount. That was under the sleeper cab where the driver would sleep behind his front seat there. But generally, we actually see them in an enclosed trailer in the back. And they'll be concealed amongst a lot of produce like watermelons and oranges and that kind of thing. We've seen them concealed with, dog food. And when you've got that enclosed trailer in the back that's full from top to bottom, it's very easy to throw a duffel bag up near the front and conceal it in these large pallets and large loads of legitimate produce and cargo. So we see that especially with the bigger loads. Um, and that's important to know because the cartels are moving so many drugs and they need to keep that supply chain going. They need to use those economies of scale. It's not efficient for them to uh, give 1,000 pills to somebody and body carry it across and walk it across the border. Does that happen? Of course, it does happen. It happens quite a bit. But for cartels who need to move 5 million pills a day or a week, they've got to do it on a motorized vehicle. It doesn't make any sense to have 300 pounds of pills and drugs, um, on somebody's back as they're trying to walk 40 miles across the desert. So they're going to do it in these types of vehicles. Passenger vehicles as well. They very, very common. I think you're looking at a Hyundai Sonata here, a silver one. It's the back bumper. It's just a natural void in that rear bumper, and they've got all these pills concealed in there. Right, more than 500,000 fake fentanyl pills. Very common. They'll just find natural voids throughout the vehicle, whether that be in the car seats, under the car seats, in the dashboard, in the engine compartment, in the natural voids in the doors. Very common. They'll create artificial voids, and they'll sometimes use electronic mechanisms that will open a secret door and whatnot, or you press a sequence of buttons on the radio or the air conditioner, and that will open up a panel that's electronically activated and show you the drug load and whatnot. So that's how they're loading them up. I can tell you, if you look on that picture on the right, they've got nicknames of the recipients of these loads. There's a Gordo and a Primo. Generally, once they cross these loads, so they load them up in Mexico, they'll drive them, stage them, they'll get them across. They immediately need to stop somewhere and unload. Because if they got 1 million pills in one vehicle, generally those pills aren't going to one particular place. Maybe 250 are coming to Utah, but the rest might be heading off to the Atlantic seaboard. So they need to drop it off at a stash house, either in a place like Tucson or Phoenix, or Chula Vista, San Diego. They'll drive it up to LA and they'll hit a stash house, and then they'll start carving up that load for the different destinations. So when I say, if you look at that picture on the right, those nicknames generally are largest suppliers of drugs in the Salt Lake Valley. The big players here will go to Gordo or Primo, those folks. And those folks are the ones who are sitting on the US side of the border, along the southwest border in places like Phoenix or LA. So that's how those are going to be our domestic sources for the biggest players that we have generally here in the Salt Lake Valley and across Utah. Sometimes they don't conceal them. It's just too easy. They're so easy to make and inexpensive to make. Like they sometimes don't really care if they lose a load. They lose 1 million fake pills. No big loss to them. That's easy. They can make that in half a day, out of just a small percentage of the labs running 24/7. So you can see here is a picture. These pills were headed up north to our area. But you can see just millions and millions of pills here just stacked up in Lowe's buckets sitting in the trunk of a vehicle. So once they've crossed, they said they need to go to a stash house to get broken down. Well, how do they get up here to Utah? Well, we know all those routes as well. It's no secret, and it's not complicated. They take the path of least resistance. They want to use the main arterial routes. They don't like winding around back roads generally. They will, but they generally don't. They like to jump on the major highways. Like I said, San Isidro there, just south of San Diego, that's a major port. They'll take that and jump on the Interstate 15, just basically a couple of miles after they cross the border, and they run it up to Vegas, all the way up to Salt Lake City and beyond to Montana and Alberta, the places like that. Interstate 15 is the most heavily used drug corridor, north-south drug corridor in the Western United States. So there's a ton of drugs coming up that way. But it's also very common for our drugs here in Utah to come up through Phoenix as well. They'll come through again a lot of those different ports, Nogales, Lukeville, Yuma. They'll come through Lukeville and Yuma as well. But we know it. Like I've listened to all those wiretaps, and they'll cross the border. They'll say, "Okay, I'm on the 19. I'll be in Phoenix in an hour and a half, and I'll drop it off." They'll generally everything is so compartmentalized within these cartels. So whoever crosses it, that's usually their job. They just cross it and get it to the stash house immediately. And then they'll load up another vehicle and they'll get a transporter, a courier, who generally will know what they're transporting. They may not know specifically what type of drug it is, but they're told like drive this up to Phoenix or drive it up to Salt Lake City. Um, I'll call you in about 12 hours and I'll tell you where to park. You'll park at a Walmart, just drop the car, leave it unlocked, go inside, shop for an hour, and then come back. And that's all they know. What happens when they go into that Walmart is that the local dealer will drive over to the Walmart, pick up the car, and drive it over to their house or to a local stash, unload it, and drive it back and leave it empty. And they may leave a little bit of money in there for the driver to drive back down to Mexico. So very compartmentalized. When you stop folks along this route, oftentimes they know very little about the overall operations, and that's the intent. And that's very, very purposeful. So there's very few folks along this supply chain that actually have a lot of knowledge about the overall operations. Interestingly, a lot of coke comes up. The majority of coke that comes in the United States comes up through Southern California, and actually it takes this route, jumps through Reno and jumps on the 80. We get a lot of coke. UHP does a lot of coke interdiction, a lot of interdiction, and their coke interdiction loads are heavily on the Interstate 80 as they're coming across Nevada and into Utah and then beyond as well. So one of the reasons that we see such huge loads and seizures seized by Utah Highway Patrol in southern Utah is because they've got these massive loads. These massive loads, they've just left the southwest border and now they're on their way. And a lot of times they're going to hit Salt Lake and drop a portion off and then continue eastbound as well. Sometimes they don't make it up to Salt Lake and they'll take an eastbound turn on I-70 there and head off towards Denver. But when UHP hits those loads, they might hit like a million pills. Well, not necessarily all those million pills were destined for Utah or Salt Lake City. Probably a portion were, but they're going to stop in Denver and St. Louis and Kansas City and Chicago, Detroit, all the way out to New York and places like that, all along the Atlantic seaboard. So when UHP hits them here, though, they're pretty fat with drugs, and so it's not uncommon to see really, really big seizures out of those interdiction efforts. Certainly, this is sort of a generalization as well. Yes, they'll come up through Moab. They will take some back roads to try to avoid agencies like UHP who they know are out there interdicting. So they'll try to take some back roads every now and then. But the majority of drugs are coming near these routes. 2 years ago, this used to be 40%. 4 out of 10 pills that our DEA laboratory tested had a potential lethal dose of fentanyl. That's 2 milligrams. That's just enough to fit on the tip of a pencil. Then it went from 40% to 60%, and now we're at 70%. So the cartels have increased the amount of fentanyl generally in the pills. So like I said, 2 milligrams is what we consider to be a potential lethal dose of fentanyl. And I'll show you a picture of kind of what that looks like as well. But again, what the picture I don't have is the one of it sitting on the tip of a pencil. But again, it's pretty scary. There's if I have time at the end, I'll kind of share that CDC chocolate chip cookie analogy that they use when they're talking about bits of fentanyl within a pill. There's going to be some pills that may not have anything in there, might not have any fentanyl in there. So you might have somebody who is experimenting, a young teen, for example, who takes a pill and is like, man, I didn't feel anything. And then the next pill kills them in 40 seconds because it has that potential lethal dose and they don't have a tolerance for that type of drug. 50 times more potent than heroin, 100 times more potent than morphine. There's something called carfentanil that's out there. It's a sedative used for large animals like elephants, rhinoceroses. That's 100 times more potent than fentanyl. There's a whole other bunch of synthetic opioids called nitazines that are starting to emerge. I might talk about that at the end. But that's what 2 milligrams looks like, just a tiny little bit. And then if you kind of reflect and think about what those cartel chemists, quote unquote chemists, are doing when they're pressing this stuff into pills. They're using metal and wooden spoons and metal bowls and just kind of mixing this stuff by hand. There are no quality controls at all. And so they have no idea how much fentanyl is getting put into these pills, and it creates a very dangerous situation for the end user. Our lab techs who test these pills all day long, every day, millions of pills every year, can't tell the difference between what is authentic and what is fake. If they can't, we certainly can't. And in fact, if you can look closely here, the authentic pills actually don't look quite as polished and clean as the fake pills. So that just means that the cartels have gotten really good at pressing these pills and making them look identical to a legitimate oxycodone pill. That's the form that we see. So as we're kind of coming down from that 100,000 foot level, now I'm going to start talking a little bit more about specifics and showing you the types and forms of fentanyl that we're seeing here in our communities in Utah. But again, they're meant to replicate these a legitimate oxycodone pill stamped with an M on one side and generally a 30 on the other. It could be a different number too. But that's what they look like. They can be bright blue. It was a couple of years ago, right about this time. And we're about maybe it was early October, about 2 years ago. And the media was banging on the door here, asking about the dangers of fentanyl, rainbow fentanyl, because it was referred to as Skittles, as a street term. It looks like candy. It looks fun. It looks exciting for kids. It looks clearly intended for kids as a marketing aspect. And people were worried that kids were out trick-or-treating were going to be handed these pills and they were going to overdose and die. Um, Certainly, we didn't have any intel that would indicate that that was going to happen then, and we've never had any intel since then about that. But I totally understand why parents are worried about that. I mean, just look at the stuff. Um, Clearly marketed towards that younger generation. And that's all it was. It was a marketing ploy. Like I said, there's generally three things that the cartels use to press into these pills. It's fentanyl, of course, an excipient powder, which is the coloring agent. You can think of it as like food coloring, and then a binding agent to hold it in pill form so it doesn't disintegrate in your hands or disintegrate in a bottle. But that excipient powder is essentially meaningless. You can buy it in any color. You can buy it online from China. And you can buy it in any color, and it doesn't change the potency. It doesn't change anything about the pill. Our scientists, lab techs, confirm that it's all just about marketing. And when that first hit the streets here in Utah a couple of years ago, when we started seeing it, um, it was sold at a higher premium, saying, "Oh, these are stronger highs, the longer highs and stronger highs. If you burn the pills, the yellow ones burn different than the blue ones." It was all BS. It was all a marketing scam by the cartels to try to introduce something new and to drive that addiction through our communities into a new, younger generation. Speckled fentanyl pills too. We see that again. It's just a mix of different excipient powders that have different colors. There's no They're not any more potent than just the straight blues. But those are out there as well. They came shortly after the rainbow fentanyl pills hit the streets. And then if you look at the picture in the middle, that's something I'll talk a little bit more about because I see that as an emerging trend. We see it nationally and we see it here in Utah. For me, it's very disturbing, but they're changing the way that they tablet the pills. So those are fake fentanyl pills. They're called Versace pills. I took this picture. It's not very good, but if it were better, you could actually see that there's a V for Versace on one side, and on the other is a Medusa head with the snakes coming out of her as her out of her head as her hair. Um, Very similar to what we see with the club drug ecstasy, Molly. And again, just another marketing scheme by the cartels to push the product out there. Sometimes, like I said before, they'll leave it in powder form. And you're looking at a kilogram of fentanyl powder. Now, when they leave it in this form, generally it's not 100% fentanyl. They'll dilute it. The cartels will dilute it. They'll add an adulterant to it and reduce it down to about 14 to 17% pure fentanyl, and they'll distribute it that way. They've now this number is not particularly significant to the potency. This number actually refers to where it came from within Mexico and who supplied this particular brick of fentanyl powder. But now they've evolved that stamping pattern. It's still numbers, but those numbers represent kind of a coded system of potency so that when they arrive into the US, they open up, they can look at these bricks and they know if it's 40% or 70% or 60% fentanyl. The picture in the middle was one of the first powder fentanyl seizures. I think it was the first powder fentanyl seizure that law enforcement made here in Utah. Our office made that one. So you can see they had some purple powder there, and it's a kind of clay, almost like that chalk. But they also had some regular blue fake pills as well. And then that chalk powder there on the right, it's very similar to the consistency of children's sidewalk chalk that they might use to draw something on the sidewalk or on the driveway. But again, it can be in any color, um, and it's 100% fentanyl. Um, the majority of those pills that we see, the majority of the fentanyl that we see, it's in this blue pill form. And if you remember that mental snapshot I asked you to take of that PBS special as she was painting across the room, there was a tube of fentanyl pills that had been wrapped in carbon paper and then taped on the ends and then shrink wrapped. This was a seizure that our office made a few months ago. Not a great picture, really, but if you were to take one of these packages up and you were to hold it and flip it in your hands, you would see that it's tube shaped. It's wrapped in carbon paper with blue packaging tape on the ends to seal off the ends, and then shrink wrap and vacuum seal, excuse me. Um, Very interesting kind of circumstantial evidence that the cartels are their drugs are here and they're landing here. And this was about 300,000 pills that you're looking at here, pulled out of a void in a passenger vehicle. Said I wasn't really going to talk about meth, but I guess I lied. Um, you can't talk about fentanyl or meth without the other. Like I said, meth is a huge and prevalent, persistent problem here in Utah. It's like I said, it's not gotten any better. It hasn't been supplanted by fentanyl. And in fact, the majority of other drugs like methamphetamine, cocaine, black tar heroin, um, have fentanyl in it. And so they're all, I think you have to assume that regardless of whatever drug you're looking at in front of you, it has fentanyl in it. And these organizations, these distributors, these networks, they're polydrug. They're not strictly fentanyl distributors. They're not strictly methamphetamine distributors. It's not I sell guns and that kind of thing, or we're gang members and we do, petty crimes. Drugs are part of all of this, and it's all the drugs. So generally, when we seize drugs, or we target an organization who's distributing these large quantities of drugs, we're going to get meth, we're going to find cocaine, we're going to find black tar heroin, and we're going to find a lot of pills, and we're going to seize a whole bunch of firearms from them as well. How are they doing it? Gosh, when I started, um, it was a lot of hand to hands, a lot of folks meeting in folks in dark alleys in the middle of the night with their hoodies on. Apparently, if this is if this photo is has any truth to it, a lot of face to face interaction though, and then cell phones came along, and then that people things got very compartmentalized, and we utilized a lot of wiretaps in that 15 years ago. That's how they were setting up these drug deals and these transactions. And now we've evolved even further, and now it's all social media. The the majority, the vast majority of all of the drug transactions are happening on Snapchat and TikTok and Instagram, WhatsApp, where a 15-year-old is sitting on their living room couch watching a football game with their dad, but on Snapchat being marketed an assortment of drugs, and they're able to complete that transaction with Cash App, Venmo, Zelle, and the drugs are dropped off at their front porch or in their mailbox or somewhere that they ask to somewhere else that they want them dropped off at, and there's never any face-to-face contact. They don't know each other. They feel very safe. um, they don't have to go out at night. They can do it from their bedroom without their parents knowing. And so that's the evolution of today's drug transaction now. And I always tell the parents, we're about to step into Red Ribbon Week for or sort of Red Ribbon season, anyways, in October. And whenever I'm in front of the schools and the parents and the parent teacher associations, I say, man, you got to monitor what your kids are doing on social media. You've got to be a little bit intrusive because they're being preyed upon by these drug traffickers. And the thing is that it's really difficult for law enforcement um, to make a case out of that because that end-to-end encryption is almost impenetrable. It isn't impenetrable by us. And so I think I have a slide here. So when I show this slide, a lot of folks are like, "Oh man, I need to memorize that." You see a lot of folks raising their cameras up, like, "I need to get a photograph of this." Well, the thing is, there's no longer a need for these little secret emoji codes. With that end-to-end encryption in places like Snapchat, they'll take a picture, they'll distribute it, they'll spread out a bunch of drugs on their kitchen counter. They'll take a picture of it and they'll send that out with prices. And then that image, that evidence will immediately disappear forever. And they understand that, and they understand law enforcement can't retrieve that. And so it does make our job a lot more difficult. But there is no more, really barely a need anymore to talk in code, to use code words, to use code emojis. It's all already encrypted organically in the application itself. But that's how they're reaching our kids. That's how they're reaching our young adults as well. I'll throw that fact out there since I'm on it. Right? 110,000 people, Americans, died of a drug poisoning last year. 70% of those involve fentanyl. Right? That, just for context, that's you fill up the Rice Eccles Stadium twice to capacity. That's how many Americans died last year. Um, and the majority of those transactions are happening on applications like you see here. They complete those transactions, like I said, Cash App, Venmo, Zelle, all electronic. We see a lot more cryptocurrency payments with things like Ethereum, Bitcoin. Um, we follow dealers driving around catching rides with Ubers. They'll jump in an Uber with 50,000 pills. Um, it's not uncommon. We interdict and seize a lot of loads coming through the postal service, through FedEx and whatnot as well. So again, it's that removal from ever having to meet a dealer. It's the kids feel very safe. Our youth feel everybody at that point feels very, very safe. Even the dealers feel safe. They feel like they're not going to get robbed because they don't ever have to meet anybody. I throw this up here really just to kind of give you an overview of where things are headed, so maybe some trend lines. Um, I kind of take those Coke seizures with a grain of salt. Like, I want to see if that does turn into a trend. Like UHP and DEA, we've had some massive kind of outlier seizures of Coke in the last couple of years. But I don't know that those were necessarily coming into Utah. I think maybe a portion were, but I kind of want to see over the next couple of years, what happens with cocaine there. But again, meth, huge problem. Black tar heroin, still very common here. But man, that top left, uh, clearly an exponential climb. And I can tell you it's going to continue exponentially in 2024. Last year, my office seized about 664,000 fentanyl pills, just my office. Um, by the end of June, we had already seized about 800,000 of 2024. So we'd already surpassed all of last year by the end of June. So we're certainly on track um, to play into that exponential curve, sadly. I just have a couple more slides, and I think I'm on time here actually. So two or three more slides, I think. And I'll bring up xylazine because we're starting to see it here in Utah. It's most commonly added to fentanyl. The scariest thing in my mind about xylazine, you might have heard, uh, it's a drug used as a sedative that vets use for animals. Um, this slide is actually a little old. I probably need to update it. It's now 49 out of 50 states. The only state that DEA has not seized it in is Wyoming. It's definitely there. We just haven't detected it in a seizure yet. Um, Nationally, almost 25% of fentanyl contains xylazine. Now, the majority of that is back on the Atlantic seaboard, and that's usually the trend, is that when a new drug comes out or a new additive or adulterant, it usually hits the Atlantic seaboard in places like New York, Baltimore. It moves south into the southern United States, then back up to the Midwest, and then westward across to places like Utah. That's generally the trend. So what we see in New York and Baltimore and Philadelphia and Pittsburgh with this where xylazine is uh, is in high demand and it's in almost everything. Um, if the trend proves true, we will see more and more and more of it over the next couple of years. So um, and we have seen it. We have seen it here, just in not huge quantities, and certainly not the DEA hasn't seen it in really big quantities. Where do you get it from? Uh, China. If you were to pull out your phone right now and Google xylazine for sale online, um, free shipping, I don't know. Uh, that's what I did, and this is a screenshot from what came up there on the left. You can buy it online for about $8 a kilogram, which is almost nothing. That's almost cheaper than an inert adulterant that you would generally add to fentanyl. So if xylazine, which will actually increase the effect of fentanyl and extend the duration, the high of the duration of the fentanyl high, why not add xylazine instead of a more expensive inert substance? That's kind of what folks are doing now. Um, the photos on the right were actually straight xylazine. This was a seizure in St. Louis on Valentine's Day. Um, it was just xylazine mixed with another substance and kind of pressed into rose shapes. And that's when we really started to see it just a couple of years ago and really got on DEA's radar again. Xylazine's been around for a while. Obviously not legit when it advertises that it's 100% going to pass customs, right? It should be a red flag to everybody. The thing about xylazine too that's really important to understand is that it does not respond to naloxone. So that's not an opioid. So like we want We want folks to have access to naloxone for a fentanyl overdose or a fentanyl poisoning. Take the naloxone, uh, multiple doses if necessary. Well, if there's xylazine in it, that naloxone unfortunately is not going to affect or counteract the xylazine. So common sense tells you that you're going to have more overdose deaths as a result of fentanyl being mixed with xylazine. I think this is my last slide here, and I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but the tableting variations, we're seeing a lot of this now in Utah. That photo on the right, that's MDMA, the club drug, Molly, ecstasy, right? And they've been doing this for a long time where they'll press it into these fun shapes and patterns and colors, Bart Simpson heads, Christmas trees, um, YouTube, Warner Brothers, I can see a Domino's there, definitely targeting our youth. Now we're seeing the cartels do the same thing with fentanyl pills. You see the again that Versace pill there in the middle with the blue Medusa heads and the V on the back. TikTok pills with the TikTok symbol there in the pink just to the left. Um, Again, those are just fentanyl pills. That's just fentanyl mixed with a binding agent, pressed with a different dye in a press. Above that are Tesla pills. There's a Tesla logo on one side. They're pressed into a triangle shape and in a certain assortment of colors. To the right of that is a Xanax. That's a fake Xanax bar. It's fentanyl, straight up fentanyl. Um, there's no anything other than fentanyl in that pill aside from a binding agent. And then that bottom left picture is a fake Adderall pill. So it's meth. There's no, it's not a legitimate pill. It's just straight up meth that's been mixed in there. So we're seeing that tableting variation. I think folks need to be aware of that. We'll try to get the message out about that those blue pills and how they replicate the oxycodones, the legitimate oxycodones. But the cartels are taking it in another direction, and one that's very similar to what we saw with MDMA. So you can see how this stuff would look fun and appealing to kids, to teenagers. It's in their nature to experiment and want to try new things. But like I said, 2 milligrams of fentanyl um, is potentially lethal. This is what we talked about, kind of that supply chain. We went up to that 100,000 foot level. We talked about precursors coming from China over to Mexico. They take control of it, manufacture, synthesize, package it up, transport it up to the border across. We talked about the Sinaloa cartel being the drug supplier for Utah. The majority of them, of the drugs coming here, come from the Sinaloa cartel. I showed you a bunch of different forms of fentanyl and what it looks like, the chalk, the speckled pills, the blue pills, the rainbow, the powders. I showed you some pictures of guns and drugs as well from some of our local seizures. And we talked a little bit about emerging trends. So that's it. For the first time ever. Maybe I'm on time. But if you have questions, please fire away. I may not have an answer, but I can always find an answer.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gillespie. I would be lying if I said that we are not alarmed beyond belief by what you're saying here. And I would like to open it with for questions. I would like to ask you how would you characterize the high from fentanyl?
Gosh, I would probably be the wrong one to ask that. So
Okay.
relative, so I would say a fentanyl is a depressant, and it really kind of depends on what's I think how it's being ingested and with what other substances it's being ingested. But it's a depressant, slows down, kind of a euphoria, slows down your respiratory system, potentially to the point where it stops working, it fails, you stop breathing, you fall asleep and you stop breathing. Um, you know, I've been in a couple of different houses where that's happened a couple purposefully. They took fentanyl with a purpose and propofol with the purpose of ending their life. But yeah, fall asleep, pass out, and that's it. Fentanyl versus heroin has a very strong, potent high, but it's generally in shorter duration. If you
Yeah.
mix it with a stimulant like meth, um, you're rolling the dice. You could get that fentanyl could end up amplifying the stimulant high from the meth,
Mhm.
or that meth could end up amplifying that depressant effect that the fentanyl would take lead on. And so you kind of don't really know. And I think everybody sort of responds a little bit differently. And that's based off of my conversations with medical doctors as they kind of explain that, yeah, it can go either way, and so
Yeah.
it really
Because we get asked, how will the kids act? How can I
yeah,
tell? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so
yeah.
a question from the chat is what is the probability of fake pills getting mixed with other similar looking pills at pharmacies, etc.?
I would say very low. So DEA, half of DEA is what we call diversion. So we have enforcement on one side, and then the other side we have diversion. And diversion is responsible for regulating and monitoring the manufacturing and supply chain of illicit drugs, of those controlled substances. So the ones that doctors will prescribe at a hospital that you might pick up at a pharmacy. Everybody who touches those drugs, everybody from Pfizer and everybody in there to the distribution warehouses, to the storage warehouses, to the pharmacist, to the pharmacy techs, to the doctor who prescribes those drugs to you. They're all registered with the DEA. And when they're registered with the DEA, we know who they are and we audit them regularly. It helps us identify those doctors who may be overprescribing and whatnot. We have a lot of data systems that monitor all of that. So there are a lot of regulations. Could it happen? Anything is possible. But the cartels don't want that. The cartels want to take control over um, their own distribution. Right?
Mhm.
They don't want any. They don't. Their distribution right now is perfect in their minds. They're making huge profits, um, and they will not make any effort in order to try to taint the legitimate supply of drugs out there. So I think those that the chances of that are low.
Okay, thank you so much. And I have a question from Maisa. You want to ask it? Go ahead.
Yes, just a question. You said that kids get that these days in social media. So they just type fentanyl. How do they do it? Like how do they find the people that is giving them the pills?
Yeah, that's a good question. It really kind of depends. I don't know that I have a really good answer for you. I was just talking to a reporter. I was doing an interview, and he said he was sitting at home, just scrolling through Instagram on his own, and somehow, according to him, maybe he wasn't giving me all the information, but something came up and he tapped on it, caught his interest, and there was a spread of drugs. He was looking for, and it was basically somebody who was indicating that he had drugs for sale and gave him an opportunity to send him a direct message so they can engage and start talking about prices and whatnot. Um, yeah, I'm sure that you can do searches to find these individuals. And the thing is, too, as part of that, I know you didn't ask this specifically, but a lot of parents ask, well, my kid doesn't have any money. Like, I'm not really concerned about them getting our hands on drugs. They don't have any money. Like, they get their money from me. And the thing about fentanyl and a lot of the other drugs is that essentially they're going to get them for free. They're going to get those drugs for free because, 5 pills that costs a drug dealer 50 cents. So I'm going to give you those 5 pills because I know you're going to come back hooked, wanting more. So I'm going to front you those pills for free. And I might even give you more than that so you can hand them out to your friends for free and just give you, it comes along with my business card. Just call me when you want more. And so you see that that's very common, is that you don't even have to pay for these things a lot of times because that's what they're doing. They're trying to expand their client and customer base, and so they're willing to front those drugs and give them out for free because they know they'll immediately be hooked, and they'll be coming back, and they'll eventually make thousands and tens of thousands of dollars off of these folks.
Thank you so much for your answer. Hey, what is one thing that we can all do to help this situation?
Well, shoot, I guess spread the word. I think I sometimes feel like a broken record about fentanyl and what it is, but it's everywhere. I do kind of a lot of speaking to schools and to parents and different community outreach programs, um, and I see where our cases work. Our cases they're every part of the valley and every part of the state. This is not like a West Valley problem. Um, I was doing a talk down in Alpine and Highlands there where the homes are $3 to $5 million and up. And I can't tell you how many times we've been doing surveillance down there, following dealers, dropping off pills and whatnot. It affects everybody, every demographic, every age, every part of the valley is affected by fentanyl. And I think what's important to know is that if that pill didn't come directly prescribed to you from a licensed practitioner, you have to assume it's fake. Right? You can only take pills that were prescribed directly to you by a doctor. Because otherwise, if you see it online, if you see a website, a dark, we do a lot of cases on the dark web, but we just see it everywhere else too. Um, you have to assume it's fake. It is fake, unless it's being prescribed directly to you. So, yeah,
Um,
it's a tough message to get out there for kids. But uh, but yeah, I think just talking about it and having that conversation, it's important. I always think about, and I don't mean to end this on a sad note, but you know, we arrested a guy named Colin Shepard, and he was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. But years ago, I don't know, 6 years ago, I think, he was up in Park City. He was a 15-year-old kid, and he sold pills to two other 15-year-old kids, and they died as a result of it, two classmates. And one of those kids was at home doing his homework in his bedroom on his laptop, and his mom peeked in, and he was asleep on his laptop. And she kind of smiled, and she thought it was kind of funny, so she took a picture of him and was going to show it to him in the morning.
mm,
That he had been working so hard, and then the next morning she noticed that his bedroom light was still on, and she walked in there and he hadn't moved and he had died and passed out. His respiratory system had shut down. He went to sleep, and it's just it's a sad tale of woe, and the ripple effect of that one death across the Park City community and across this valley. It's I would venture to guess that every single person on this call knows somebody that is dealing with a substance use disorder, or has lost somebody, a friend or a relative. Um, like we got to start talking about it and get these people the help that they need, and from our perspective in the enforcement side of things, target those cartel members who are profiting off of the addiction. So yeah, just getting the word out. If um, talk to your kids, find an audience, and shout from the rooftops, I guess.
thank you. Thank you so much. I like when you say move past the stereotype because it's so easy to go, that's not us,
That's right.
and assume that it's somebody else's problem, but it's all of our problem. It's our
That's
kids.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gillespie. Any other final words from anyone? Any other question? Because we are out above the time. So don't feel any kind of bad way because it's just that people have to drop off because they only have 1 hour lunch.
Yep. No,
So
thank you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Anytime.